At some point during the 1980s, Hulkamania ran wild. And because of Hulkamania, there became the rise of sports entertainment. Now, due to the rise of sports entertainment, the sort of sport of pro wrestling sort of began to fade. Over the years, the sport of sports entertainment faded more and more. Now, sports entertainment is really just entertainment. And because of that, there has become a rise of new fans, sort of people who are not really interested in the sport part of sports entertainment, but in the fantasy elements of the idea of pro wrestling as theater. And this conversation today is going to be about how wrestling fans just became general nerds. So today we're going to talk about nerdism, nerd culture, what I call the Big Bang Theory of wrestling, based off the TV show, which made comic books and all that type, video games and all that type of stuff mainstream. Because that stuff used to be, used to get made fun of for being in Dungeons and Dragons and all that type of crap. Now it's sort of mainstream, and now you kind of see the same thing with wrestling, where it's becoming a little bit more mainstream, and it's partly Vince McMahon's fault. Like I said, the 1980s really injected pro wrestling into the mainstream. And now as an entertainment venue, it was already there as a sport, but as people began to know that it wasn't real, it sort of changed. So let's talk about that. So in the era of Hulkamania, which I'm going to give the full length of Hulkamania from 1984, when Hulk Hogan first really made his big run, to 1994. Or either you can go to 1996, which would include Hulk Hogan having a run in WCW. You started seeing a lot of loud, garishly colored, superheroic wrestlers. Sting, the Ultimate Warrior, all of these guys, the Road Warriors, what they call the Legion of Doom in the WWE. The Undertaker, Kane. Well, Kane came later. He came in 1997. But, those types of characters, they were doing outlandish things like the like the Dungeon of Doom in WCW and all these sorts of things. And it was all so cartoonish. It was basically like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe taking place in a real life setting. That's pretty much what pro wrestling was in the late 80s and in the early to mid 90s. Then the Attitude Era happened. The Attitude Era, guys started really kind of wrestling under their real names. A little bit more realism became a bigger deal. A lot of the cartoonish gimmicks kind of vanished and disappeared, or they kind of started being downplayed. There became very few. There became very few cartoonish gimmicks. Very few Undertakers still going on in the mid to late 90s. Even though, yes, there was, I think Vampiro was there and they were doing Crow's thing, but he wasn't magic, there was basically just Undertaker and Kane that was doing magic stuff. Everybody else was kind of subdued. They may have been outlandish, but they were more realistic. Hell, a porn star is far more realistic than than most of the stuff that was going on in the early 90s, especially Papa Shango and Mantar and the Shockmaster and all that crap, right? So the Attitude Era lasted for a good long while until about 2007, 2008. Now I know I'm sort of wiping over the Ruthless Aggression Era, but the Ruthless Aggression Era was basically just a continuance of some of the elements of the Attitude Era. Just a lot of the Attitude Era stars were gone. Rock was gone, Austin was gone, Goldberg was gone, DDP was gone. All those guys were gone, or at least they were. If they were in WWE, they were off and on. Like Goldberg had a 1 year run. I wouldn't say that he did a lot, but if you want to, but the sex and the violence are pretty much what continued. Some of the themes of the Attitude Era continued into the Ruthless Aggression Era, even though the top stars had changed until the Benoit tragedy happened. So when Benoit took place, it became very, very real. It became too real. Chris Benoit murdered his wife and his son. Everybody was like, oh no, what is going on? WWE took a sharp turn from that point back into cartoon land. Just we had the PG era. And all of a sudden, here comes the cartoonishness. It all came back. The goofy characters. It wasn't as goofy as it was before, but a lot of the goofy characters started coming back. A lot of the silly storylines started to come back. They were still doing things that were a little bit outlandish. Now they became more so. Then, of course, you have today, you have The Fiend who disappears and reappears. You got Matt Hardy teleporting all over the place. You have these kinds of storylines that are going on now. So over the years, the sports element of sports entertainment, the sports element of wrestling, actually was on its deathbed. The only people who were really doing sports was basically Ring of Honor. Everyone else, even TNA during the what we call the Ruthless Aggression era, had Abyss. They had Messias. They had supernatural characters with supernatural backgrounds that were still sort of cartoonish. You still had, your smaller athletic guys, but you still also had, your over the top characters. So, people kept trying to keep the sport of sports entertainment alive. Ring of Honor. Back in the day is ECW. They were claiming they were the sport of professional wrestling, even though they were doing deathmatch bullshit. Right? Then you had Ring of Honor. They were trying to do the sport, and then New Japan tried to bring the sport base to the United States. And then, we had that. It kept failing though. For starters, ECW wasn't sports. The more sport they did, the quicker they seemed to fall. Even the only promotion that did straight up sports based pro wrestling that is still around is Ring of Honor. That's it. In New Japan. And New Japan is a completely different country. In the United States, usually the company gives way to what people want to see. And the people did not want sports-based wrestling. And when I say the people, I mean the larger audience, not the hardcore, I like the Graps fans. I'm talking about the people when they try to get 1 million, 2 million people to watch the show. They watch the show for the outlandish characters, and sometimes the outlandish character, you have to turn a sport-based wrestler into an outlandish character in order for it really to stick. And part of this problem that about the sport and of that sort of context is you started having the dirt sheets. So the dirt sheets, of course, destroyed kayfabe. So now everything that's real is behind the camera. So nobody buys what's taking place in front of the cameras anymore. So now you have to do outrageous things, over the top things to get people to feel something. You can't do a basic storyline anymore, because then you turn around and the dirt sheets are like, oh, it's not real. It's just two guys working an angle. Now you have to do something over the top, like fake a pregnancy to get people to pay attention to what's going on your television. You have to fake like somebody's having an affair on their wife in order for people to really pay attention to, even though they were doing that stuff in the 80s. I mean, they were doing it in the 80s. I mean, World Class did stuff like that. But you had to do over the top stuff because you were in competition with everything else that was on TV. And, the dirt sheets were basically undercut every angle you tried to do if you tried to portray it as real. If you tried to make it real, the dirt sheet would just smudge it. Oh, these two guys were talking about it in the back room, blah, 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 blah. It's not real. You can't build heat that way. So what ended up happening is all of these weirdos who read the dirt sheets, ended up being wrestling fans, they were already nerds and into other characters and stuff like that. And they basically latched on to wrestling. I said this before in previous videos about the movie The Wrestler, that it really helped, and Beyond the Mat is another one. I said that it brought in the concept of the poor put upon proletariat wrestler, but it also brought in the wrestling nerd. Okay, it is when you started having wrestling on the same level as Saturday morning cartoons, even though it had already been that for a lot of people. So it fit naturally. Like I used to watch WWF Superstars at 12 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday. Right after Saturday morning cartoons, I would watch wrestling, watch Pokemon and all that shit, Yu-Gi-Oh! Or whatever the hell else I was watching. Then I watch wrestling. And then I would watch like Dragon Ball Z in the middle of the afternoon, and then Raw would come on later that night. So there was like an entire generation of people in my age group who have connected pro wrestling to video games, because in the past, it was a sport they didn't really have video games. But we had like In Your House, which was a cartoonish video game. You also had all of the video games like, the Nintendo 64 stuff and the PlayStation stuff and all that stuff. So you started seeing it became a highly merchandised industry. And so it became unreal largely unreal, partly due to the dirt sheets telling you everything is not real, partly due to the presentation by the promotions of it not being real. And then, of course, then the shoot interviews started happening. So now all the shoot interviews are coming out, and the wrestlers are talking about the characters as if the character is a completely different person. So they were of course pulling the sheet back even more. Sometimes they were even confirming what the dirt sheet said. So you can't really just say, "Oh, this is dirt sheet, blah, who cares?" A lot of these guys were going out there, your Cornettes and your Kevin Nashes and your uh, Sullivans and all these guys. So it became impossible for people to take it seriously as a serious sport. No matter how much they say that they wanted it to, it was impossible for them to take it seriously. So it lent the promotions to being more and more and more over the top as far as characters are concerned, so that people will know that it's not real. So it went from real graps, exchange of holds, then they kind of invented the concept of a finishing move, which I heard was actually a thing in boxing as well. But then they started doing the outlandish colors. You started seeing people play characters. They would be different people in front of TV and then different people when the TV was off. It started, it's really just kind of built up. And then people were told that it wasn't real. And then they saw things that couldn't possibly be real, like wrestling zombies or, and things like that. So it couldn't possibly be real. So now the dirt sheets are telling you every nook and cranny of things that's not real. So you have this wall now that used to exist has crumbled down. So everybody who was a fan of the sport of professional wrestling sort of walked away. And then the body blow, the real left hook to the ribs happened because UFC showed up. So now people get to see real combat sports in a way that pro wrestling used to be. And now a lot of those people went over there towards that. So now you have the strict dichotomy of people who are interested in the sport of pro wrestling. They just watch UFC. And people who are into the theater aspects, the nerdiness of pro wrestling, they watch Raw, SmackDown, TNA, and some of them may watch Ring of Honor, a smaller number of people. But that became that dichotomy. So then you started getting the politics started mixing into it. And this is actually a recent development. Within the last couple of years, you started seeing we need to boycott WWE because Vince McMahon is a Republican. Or, Vince McMahon is friends with Trump, or Vince McMahon is friends with Bush, or whatever the hell, right? So you started seeing that happen. And then AEW came. So now AEW came and they started using all of the nice progressive buzzwords. We're gonna have equality, and we're gonna have the the wrestlers are gonna be in charge, even though Tony Khan's in charge and he's a billionaire, but whatever. They hit all the right notes as far as the progressive angle started happening, and the progressivism, the progressive politics had already taken over other industries. It had taken over gaming already, because you already had Gamergate. You were, it's like near the tail end of what you would call Comicsgate, where you started having all of the feminists and all these people take over these industries. And now AEW was going to be born from that progressive idea. And so you just brought in even more nerds. Even because now the wrestlers are nerds. Because back in the day, they were athletes, right? They were beer drinking, cigarette smoking, trying to get laid, trying to score some coke, and that was about it. And now you see these guys talk about their cosplaying, they're Twitch players and all this stuff, and the fans are like, wow, AJ Styles is a nerd. He plays, I don't know, Fortnite. I don't know what the fuck AJ Styles plays. I don't watch him play games, but he plays all these video games. I play video games too. He's just like me. Then you got Kenny Omega. He's coming out dressed like Undertale characters, and Cody Rhodes is doing Star Trek. And, it became one big nerdgasm that sometimes now pro wrestling, like you go to, I went to WrestleMania 23. It was just like going to an anime convention. There was people dressed like wrestlers. And this was in 2007, right? So, and it had already been this way because when I went to a wrestling show in 1996, it was similar. It wasn't the same. It was similar. But if you went to a show during the 80s or in the early 90s, it was basically an anime convention. Tons of kids with like Ultimate Warrior face paint and Undertaker hats and little Undertakers and stuff like that. It was tons of that stuff. So it was already there, but it was underneath the surface. But now it is almost completely a fucking nerd convention. And what brought this topic up is Conan and Disco Inferno were talking to Nick Aldis, and he was talking about trying to maintain the sport of professional wrestling as the NWA World Champion, trying to make the sport of pro wrestling matter in a world where people are more interested in the fantasy elements. And I love that talk so much. I'm gonna put it in the description, but I love that talk so much. I decided to just give my own spin on it. And that's what this is. So now wrestling seems to be mostly for people who still watch cartoons and anime and play video games and stuff like that. It doesn't really appeal to the guys who, that's why it's so hard to get the demos right. It's very hard to get the demo because the guys, the majority of men in the 18 to 35 demographic, or whatever the case may be, are maybe into sports. That's how, basketball always wins and football always wins and UFC wins most of the time if they have, that demographic, that opportunity to get the demographic. Because that's it. As a boy, you're pushed into athletics. Pro wrestling is now pushed into the arts. That's it still appeals mostly to men because it's still combat, physical, that type of stuff. But it's been pushed over into the arts. It's more theater now. And it's more accepting of it being theater. Very few people, continuously fight this concept. There are some Jim Cornettes out there who are like, no, wrestling should be a sport. It should be a sport. But now most people in the business, even most of the wrestlers are kind of like, yeah, it's basically theater. It's Broadway. It's this, it's that, it's art. It's an art form. I'm an artist. They've accepted it. Roman Reigns even calls himself a performance fighter, which is what Jackie Chan would call himself. Like this nerdism in pro wrestling. And this is kind of why you have to deal with, with Conan and Disco Inferno. What they were talking about is why the AEW fans are so annoying. And they basically and Disco nailed it. He was like, they're fantasy nerds. They're into Dungeons and Dragons and video games and stuff like that, which was not always the case. And I think that is partially true. I think it's 100% true. He nailed it. And that really what got me to thinking when I sat down and said, you know what? He's right. He's absolutely right. And now people do not want any pretense of sport. Like AEW can say they're trying to do a sports-based presentation. And everybody knows it's bullshit. Just because you keep track of who wins and who loses does not make it a sport. Okay? It doesn't. It's not a sport. Because you still have ridiculousness going on. There's no selling. I guess if it's a sport, it's gymnastics. Because it's still the same bad acting that WWE has. It's still a lot of standing monologues. Still a lot of comedy routines. It's still a lot of the same stuff. It's stuff that probably wouldn't have flown. Ooh, shit. That's bad grammar. It wouldn't have flown in the gritty promotions of the 80s. Your World Class and your AWA or your Mid-South, your Georgia Championship Wrestling. They probably wouldn't have done so much of this. So much silly stuff. But you can get away with it now. You can do theater now. You can be a performance fighter now. You could be a pro wrestler and need security now. I couldn't imagine. Probably in New York, you probably get away with it because they never took it seriously. But in the South, if you are a wrestler with security, it's like, ugh, you're supposed to be able to take care of yourself. You're supposed to be able to man and take care of yourself. Now, not so much. People just kind of accept that you are, just a performer. You're basically an actor. This is why every time something happens, as far as finances are concerned, people are like, you need to call SAG. You need to get you a Screen Actors Guild card. You're an actor. You know, that's just kind of how they are now. That's why these fans are so annoying. It's because they are into the fantasy elements of wrestling. And it's partially because of how wrestling has been presented via Vince McMahon. It is also how sports wrestling keeps failing as far as making a mainstream splash, because you really can't do it now because UFC exists. So anytime you see, like, I've seen people like ridicule basic collar and elbow tie-ups. Like, why would you ever do that in a fight? They don't understand that collar and elbow used to be real wrestling. It used to be real wrestling. Collar and elbow is very dangerous too, by the way. But this type of stuff, it can't be taken seriously anymore. Even the people who love watching it, as far as fighters and stuff like that, even they like the fantastical elements of it, because they do real fighting. So they don't watch it for that. They just watch what they do for that. They're watching it for the fantastical elements. And sometimes the fantastical elements include fantastical politics and all that type of stuff. So it makes people, the arts are very cliquish as well. And that's one of the things that I also wanted to talk about, is that the arts are very cliquish. It's very difficult to get into the arts. You have to know somebody. You have to be friends with certain people. You have to vote a certain way, think a certain way. You have to be very politically correct. That's kind of how the art world works. You could get banned and blackballed and stuff out of the art world really quickly. That's why there's almost no sort of quote unquote conservative artists. There's almost none. If they are, they're very quiet, just like Hollywood. Hollywood is also a clique. You have to know somebody to get in. Once you're in, there's nothing anybody can do to get you out unless you fuck up on a major scale. But it's very cliquish. Wrestling is going to become the same way. It's going to become very cliquish, where you're going to have to be a certain kind of person to get in. And then once you're in, almost nothing you could do. But it's going to be a little bit easier to kick you out because they believe in cancel culture. But, this is just me talking about how AEW fans become annoying. Why wrestling is now mostly fantasy, with, crazy fantastical characters and, loud, crazy fantastical characters at that. And why we as we try to hold on to the sport of it by saying it needs to look somewhat realistic, you have other people who are just absolutely lambasting it, doing invisible hand grenades and intergender matches. You have people twerking on each other, people setting each other on fire, stuff like that. It's hard. And I see that some people are really trying to grip and hold on to the sport of professional wrestling, and it's becoming very difficult to do so. And it's partially because a lot of us have been conditioned to just accept that wrestling is over the top cartoon theater. And in a way it is, because even the people who want sport still participated in over the top theater. Because I saw Al Snow. I saw an OVW show. It's on YouTube, and he promotes pro wrestling kind of as a sport. But Al Snow was the same guy who was carrying around a mannequin head, so he understands the theater aspect of it, of playing a character and being over the top. Jim Cornette, guy wrestled in a gorilla suit or something like that. He dressed up like a woman for a match once or twice. He's done the theater part of wrestling. It's hard to argue with these people. It's hard to argue with the progressive fan base when that's sort of your background. You see people do it all the time with Jim Cornette. He'll say, like, this looks fake, this looks stupid. And then people will say, like, didn't you have a Ninja Turtle on your show? Or whatever. And what you can do, shrug. Like, yeah, I guess. WCW had with RoboCop. The mask is off. And very few people are still trying to hold on to the sport of pro wrestling. It's dying out. But let me know what you guys think. Do you think that wrestling should go back to being more of a sport? Or do you think that the sports entertainment was sort of the nice mix? I think WWE still does sports entertainment, as far as they do a little bit of sport, but they do a lot of theater. And that's what seems to really engage people is the theater aspect of it. It hasn't gone. It's gone pretty far with like the Fiend and stuff. Like there's some fantastical elements there, but I don't think it's gone into the realm of pure fantasy yet. And the same with AEW. I don't think AEW has gone into the realm of pure fantasy, like where everybody has superpowers and or somebody's like an elf. Well, because Chris Statlander is an alien, so I was just about to say like there's no elves or elf people because WWE has had what was it Munchkin? What the fuck? He's a Munchkin. What was he? A leprechaun. So there are sometimes fantastical creatures and stuff like that, but it's going to be hard because there's what you have Luchasaurus who thinks he's a dinosaur and he talks like he's a dinosaur. Eventually you're going to have guys who are going to sit in a chair all day, and you already have dudes who do like hours and hours of makeup. Soon you're going to have dudes in like Worf costumes, like Star Trek. Some guy's going to come out and say he's a werewolf, a wrestling werewolf, and he's going to have like a mask. And it's going to be like real hair, like Chewbacca or something like that. He's going to be like, I'm a wrestling werewolf. And everybody's going to be mad. But then at the same time, it's going to be like, we all love the wrestling zombie. We let the pyromaniacs go. There's a guy who threw invisible hand grenades that is still wrestling. There's people who's wrestled the Invisible Man. We have let a lot of shit slide. When are we going to say enough's enough? When are we going to say enough's enough? So let me know in the comment section what you think. And I'll talk to you guys later.